Ever feel like your music has great potential but isn't always getting noticed? I've seen plenty of submissions from my subscribers lately that could absolutely shine with a few key tweaks to presentation, especially if you want to get your music performed, win some calls for scores, or even get accepted to some of the top conservatories in the world for classical composition. So in this video, I'm taking advantage of this super rainy day to offer practical feedback that will instantly make your music professionally presentable and playable. And if you'd like your work featured next time, submit it using the link in the description down below. All right, so this is the first piece. It's for solo oboe. And by the way, I've never seen this score before. So everything that I'm looking at is just from a first glance here at this piece for solo oboe. Okay, so the first thing that I'm gonna look at, of course, is the very top, just making sure the title and the composer look good. I blurred out the composer's name here, but trust me, it all looks really good here. So title and the composer. I wouldn't put the name of the instrument right here, oboe, just like this. I would probably either have it over here on the left side, or I would put like for oboe or for solo oboe in italics without the bold. It's not really a big deal, honestly, but just because this particular composer put this here, I just want to point that out really quickly. And by the way, if you'd like me to review your music in a future video, be sure to submit it using the link in the description below. The next thing I always look at is the metronome marking right here. So this metronome marking, a lot of people in my last video were saying, oh, the metronome markings don't matter. Yes, I know. Nowadays, they don't matter anymore because technically you can have like 66.6666794225. Yeah, true. It doesn't matter. And usually for film scores, by the way, this is a very common thing because you got to match directly to the film score. Or rather the screen. But like here, we don't really care about that, right? Because we're just writing concert music without the film. So what we tend to like to do more in the concert music space is to match it to a metronome, which is much more traditional and much more in line with the tradition of concert music. So if we go to a metronome like this, and I love using this one, metronomeonline.com, you can actually see all the notches here. So you'll notice that this particular composer here put 68 to 75. And technically speaking, 68 to 75 doesn't exist on a metronome. So if you look at the metronome right here, we have 66, we have 69, but we don't have 68. Same thing with 75. We have 72 and 76, but we don't have 75. So I would just do something like 69 to 76, and that would be basically 99.9% of the same. Okay, just FYI. So just a small little thing here. Now this composer, you'll notice, is writing the music. It's interesting. This particular composer puts it in common time. And common time is just another way of saying 4/4. In other words, you have 4 beats in a measure, 4 quarter notes in one measure. But if you look closely at each system here, there's no delineation of 4/4 at all. Actually, it just looks like it's one giant bar because there are no bar lines. Or rather, maybe you can say that this is a bar line at the very end. But really, it just seems like there aren't any bar lines, rather. So we have to really clarify what we want to do there. Is it really going to be in like a 4/4 time, or are we going to have an open-ended kind of space? Now, with a piece like this, there are definitely moments where it feels like it could be more open-ended. For example, like right around here with all these 30-second notes, that definitely looks like something that's very open-ended. But then there are moments that are less open-ended, like the beginning, for example, where we have these eighth notes getting faster than another bunch of eighth notes. We have these half notes here. We have these really clear demarcations of rhythm. And I would argue in those instances, you would want something that's more measured. So in the same piece, by the way, you can have moments that are more measured and unmeasured. That's totally acceptable. And this particular piece, I would definitely gravitate towards that. Okay, so those are the two major things, right? This is less of a major thing, to be honest, the metronome marking, but really the major thing with this is cleaning up the rhythmic organization of the piece, because the piece actually looks quite fun for the oboe and mostly idiomatic. There are things where it pops down like this F down to E, E down to D, D down to C. I mean, this is quite difficult, but it's technically possible, and so on. But I would really strongly consider, what is the rhythmic gravitas of this particular piece, right? Where do we want to feel accents in terms of downbeats? Do we want to feel those, right? And these are questions you have to ask yourself as a composer. From my standpoint here, to me, it looks like that this part of the piece up to the last part of this area here should be measured. It should be in some kind of time signature. And you can even argue that this should extend all the way to the end of this system, or even perhaps even including these triplets. But from here, definitely this A, right? This area right here, all the way to possibly these three rests right here. I would have this as an open measure, and write something like rubato or cadenza at the top here, so the player knows that they could be free, more free with how they're going to play this. Okay, so these might seem like minor adjustments, but they make a major impression to a performer, and also helps the performer interpret exactly how they should be playing this music. Now, one last thing I want to point out with this particular piece as we turn to the second page here. Since we've been talking about time signatures, now there's this moment here where the composer actually puts a time signature. We have 9/16, moving to 5/16 in the next system, and then 9/16, etc. Now, we got to be careful with how we use time signatures in general, because a time signature is going to tell the performer basically what's important to you in terms of where the stresses are in the beat. So when I'm looking at 9/16, in other words, that means 9/16 notes in one single measure. Generally speaking, especially if the composer doesn't make it obvious how the bar is divided, I'm going to assume it's 3 plus 3 plus 3. In other words, 3/16, 3/16, 3/16. The stresses are on the first 16th, the fourth 16th, and then the 7th 16th. Now, if we just take a look at these two bars, or even extend it to 3 bars, right, are we seeing that? Well, not really, right? Because we have accents on every single note, number one. And then number two, if we look at another demarcation of what makes a stress, usually to me, it's either the lowest note or the highest note in a phrase. Here we have the lowest note in the phrase, the B, which is really low on the oboe. This is one of the lowest notes on the oboe. And then on the 5th note, we have a high C sharp. And then on the second to last note, the 8th note, we have a B flat, right? So it looks like it could be 4 plus 3 plus 2 is the way that this is divided. But because we have accents all over the place here, and because we don't have demarcations in the beaming, we don't really know for sure. So this all goes to say that, does it really need to be in 9/16, right? Does it have to be in a complicated time signature? Can we do the same thing with a much simpler time signature? So to me, like, this could easily have been in a time signature like, for example, 4/4 or 3/4. You can achieve the same exact sound with a much simpler time signature. It's not going to look as sexy, right, as 9/16, 5/16, etc. But if it communicates the same exact thing, and you can do it in a simpler way, you can actually get the performer to interpret the music in a much faster way, which also gives the performer more of a reason to play your music, and they're going to be more excited to actually practice your music and ultimately to perform it. So the end of the goal, of course, is to get the music performed and get the player to actually want to play the piece again and again. But otherwise, the piece looks really fun to play. A lot of it is quite idiomatic. There are some things I would change here and there for the oboe. Before a solo piece for oboe, it looks like something that a player would have a lot of fun shedding, and I would actually be curious to hear this piece as well. Okay, so this is another solo piece for solo percussion. The Body Becomes a Landscape. Really fun title too. And just to give you kind of a heads up, he's got like a percussionist in the middle of what I think is a gong rack. So there's a lot of percussion going on here. And if you look in the diagram here, the composer explains a lot more of what's happening in terms of the choreography and why the piece was written and so on. So a lot of fun here. Now, I want to point out some things again with this score that actually have a lot of relationship with the last score that I showed you. And it has a lot to do, again, with the time signatures. Now, the nice thing is that when you write for a percussionist, you can be a little loosey-goosey with the rhythms, 8 times out of 10, let's say, because percussionists, that's what they're trained to do. They're trained to read really crazy rhythms and to really actually see them as a challenge that they're really proud to work on. So with percussionists, it's not the same as really any other instrumentalist. They're willing to shed most of the time through rhythms that are quite complex and time signatures that are quite complex. But again, my own rule applies to any kind of music, whether it's for percussion or solo violin, and that is making the time signatures, especially here, as simple and as straightforward as possible. When I'm looking at these first 2 bars, especially, we have quarter equals 74. I'm going to overlook the fact that that's not a real metronome marking, right? When you see these, you just know automatically, like 72 and 76, those are the ones on the metronome. 74 isn't. But I don't want to harp on that and get killed in the comment section. But anyway, in the second bar right here, we have a 4-2 bar. If you look at what it says quarter equals 74. So 4-2, in other words, 4 half notes in a bar. We're talking about 4 half notes. Each half note has a length, right, of 37 beats per minute, basically, because it's cut in half. So that is pretty slow to keep track of, right? That's really, really slow, actually slower than what I'm doing right now. So to think in 4 half notes, when you have these quintuplets going on, triplets going on, it's quite difficult actually. So my challenge to this particular composer is like, what if we did this in 4/4? Like, would that kill the vibe of this piece? I don't think so, right? We can have 2 bars of 4/4 right over here. It'll probably not change the piece at all. So if I just did it really quickly, right, all it would be is 1 beat, 2nd beat, 3rd beat, and this would be the 4th beat, right? And then right here would be the start of the next beat. And literally nothing would change. I guarantee it. So that way the percussionist is still thinking in quarter equals 74 and not having to think in half note equals 37. Because that's basically what's going on here when you change from 3/8, which is actually 8th note equals whatever double of this is, 148, right? You're going from 8th note equals 148 with a 3/8 bar, that's what you're doing, because there's 3/8 notes in a bar, to a half note equals 37. So it's a big like mental shift. Again, for the percussion, it's not going to be a problem, but we want to make it as easy as possible, generally speaking. So the 3/8 bar, I would even say 6/16 because we have 6/16 notes in here, but that's neither here nor there. But the 4/2 bar definitely could be 2 bars of 4/4 and make it infinitely easier to play. And the other thing is this particular composer already shows every beat, right? So it's already being written actually in 4/4. It's not being written 4/2. In 4/2, normally you would see every half note, not every beat, 8 times out of 10, let's say. So really we want to divide this into 2 bars of 4/4. Now the same thing is going to happen here with 3/2. We want to divide this into more manageable chunks, right? So probably we're going to want to do this in 2 bars of 3/4. So again, look at it with me here, measure 3. We have beat 1, beat 2, that's this half note. Beat 3 is right here. And then again, we have a second bar, beat 1, beat 2, beat 3. And there's literally no reason not to do that. And then the percussionist can actually definitely read this down a lot quicker. And so on. So all these things I would change. I would change the 4/2, 3/2, etc. That's the biggest thing right off the bat that I would do with this particular score. Now, in the second movement, I actually want to point out something really interesting that this composer did in terms of using a free notation. So in the oboe piece I showed you, there were moments where we can have free notation. Here, this composer used the entire second movement as an opportunity for free notation. Now, this is really cool because it gives the percussionist an opportunity to be more interpretive on their own. In other words, they have more agency in the piece itself. They don't have to be so exacting like this particular composer is with the first movement, where they are really exact with the quintuplets, the triplets, and so on, and where everything has to be lined up. Whereas here, as you can see, it's a complete contrast. So it's really interesting because you can build contrast, not just with melody, harmony, form, etc., but you can build contrast with rhythm and actually the agency of the player itself, the agency of the player as kind of like, subservient to the composer, which is really what the first movement is about. And the second movement here, it's quite the opposite. Actually, the composer is just basically giving a set of instructions, and then the percussionist is actually interpreting it in their own way. Of course, it's quite notated, right? But it's not as exactly notated as the first movement. This composer could definitely have notated the second movement like they did for the first movement, but I actually like that they made it open so that the percussionist can look at the score more visually and interpret it in their own way. So that's very interesting to me. So if you take a look at the first system here, we just have these gongs that ring out here, and we don't know exactly where that second gong hit, right? It's somewhere in the 4-second mark, but it doesn't have to be exact, so that's pretty cool. Then they kind of count 6 seconds here, and then we have another gong hit, and then right over here, this is quite interesting. I had to look this up in the performance notes, but this horizontal thick line right here, indicates how long to play this tremolando for. So this particular one is a tremolando that lasts up to this point. So somewhere, let's say 2-3 seconds into this bar. And then this one right here is a humming sound with the actual percussionist voice. And this one, as you can see, ends before the tremolando ends. And that's basically the instruction there. So I find it very fascinating that this composer did this for the second movement here, because it gives the player a bit more agency. It's something that we can think about as composers, actually. Do we need to notate everything exactly, right? What does it mean? Why do we do it? If I'm working with a percussionist, or this composer is working with a percussionist, how open are they to performing music like this? Really interesting questions that this second movement poses. And just so you know, if you want your music featured in a future video just like this, I invite you to send it directly to me using the link in the description below. All right, now I want to move on to our last example here. This is for violin and piano. And again, this theme for today seems to be this time signature thing for whatever reason, because right here, right from the moment here in the beginning, we have 14/8. In other words, 14/8 notes in a single bar. Now, generally speaking, I absolutely hate writing in these kind of time signatures, and I hate seeing them. Hate is kind of a strong word. But most importantly, performers don't like to see this either, because counting to anything more than 5, I would say, using the hand rule, you don't want to count to anything more than 5, especially as a performer that has to deal with a lot of different things, a lot of different mechanics. And on top of that, interpreting your piece and making music out of it. Just imagine all that brain work and emotional work that the performer has to do. And now you're asking them to count to 14, right? And these musicians are actually counting, like they're counting to 14. So something that I would consider is like, is there another way to divide this? Like, do we need to have it in 14/8, right? And even splitting it up, let's say, to 2 bars of 7/8, can that be possible? And I think it is, right? So we have this kind of lick here. If I just played on the piano, it's just this repetition of these fourths. And you can easily have this in some kind of 7/8. 7/8 would be the most obvious thing you can do, because you can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then just restart on this one. And as long as they're not accenting the downbeats, you're getting basically the same thing as you were with the 14/8. So that would be something that I would look at. I know earlier I said don't go beyond 5, but you can do 7/8 as well, especially if you have a bunch of 7/8s in a row. Musicians are used to saying that. Then you have the 9/8 here. Which is fine. That's acceptable as well. Then you have a 3/4, and then again I would just do the 7/8. So I would stick to that basically. The 14/8's not very common unless it's something really specific, which I don't think it is in this particular case. I would avoid it at all costs. Now, keeping in line that this piece is in quarter equals 193, which again I don't want to keep harping on this, but on the metronome, there is no 193. There's 192, so I would just use that. But besides that, if we go to the end of the first page here, we have the 2/2 bar. In other words, we have 2 half notes. Now, if we remember, let's say let's make the math easy and do 192. If we cut 192 in half, right, that's going to be 96, I believe. So that will be half note equals 96. So half note equals 96 for a 2/2 bar is actually quite easy to count, because it's kind of like this, right? So we have half notes. So we can count half notes quite easily in 2/2. So in this particular case, 2/2 actually makes quite a lot of sense. And this composer divided the bars basically in 2/2. And they're very easy to count in 2/2. So you have quarter, half, quarter, which is very easy. Be bum, bum, right? Very easy to count in 2/2. We have whole notes, and then we just have whole notes throughout here. So 2/2 here is actually not a bad choice in this context. So here I would actually use 2/2. The one last thing I want to point out with this score, here we are on page 3 of the music, is that if you just look at it from a wide angle lens, it's quite squished, okay? And this is one of the most common problems I see. We could easily fix this by just having 3 systems per page instead of 4 systems, and you'll have a lot more white space in between the actual systems here. Another thing I would do as well, I know that in violin and piano scores, normally we like to have this staff a bit smaller than this staff. That's perfectly fine. But it's okay to make the font size just a little bit bigger for the piano and the violin. That way, if the violinist wants to read off of the piano score, they can do so, because right now it's quite small. Some violinists, they will want to read off of this score. Some violinists will want to read off of a solo violin part. It just depends on the piece and the violinist. So I would just double check if you have somebody playing this, which one they prefer to play off of. But right now, definitely, if you just take a look at this particular page here, and not all the pages are like this, but this particular page is quite squished. See, this one is not too bad, but I would still say it's a little bit squished, but definitely not as squished as this page. We want to make sure that we're not getting super squished pages here. It's actually quite squished as well. So one last thing I want to mention is in terms of the expression markings, forte, legato, più, piano, these kind of things. I'm not going to comment on every one of these, but I just want to comment on the size of the expression markings. Now, on your YouTube screen, whether you're watching on a mobile device or on your computer, maybe it's hard to see on your mobile device, but these fonts are slightly large for the music that's being presented here. And it's probably very hard to tell if you're actually engraving this yourself, but one way to look at it is to compare your music with a professionally engraved score by someone like Barenreiter, right? A publisher like Schott, a publisher like Schirmer, Boozy and Hawks, right? There's a plethora, there's an abundance, right, of professional scores that we can take a look at, and all we have to do is copy them, right? We're not copying the music, but we can copy literally exactly what they're doing in terms of the font choices, in terms of the staff choices, in terms of the spacing, right? And if you're working on a piece like this for violin and piano, guess what? There are a ton of examples of violin sonatas that are going to be the exact models that you're looking for. So once you're done with your piece, right, don't go crazy. Don't do it while you're writing the piece. At the very end, now that you're done with the piece, go back and say, okay, how can I make this look as professionally engraved as possible? And it's literally close to impossible to do this by yourself. The best way to do it is to get feedback from an external score, like a score from Barenreiter, like a score from Schirmer, etc., and you just copy it. So you go through it. You say, okay, what do the tempo markings look like? What do the expression markings look like? What do the staff sizes look like? What do the note heads look like? What do the spaces between the systems look like? What do the bar numbers look like? Literally every single thing. Then what you're going to do is save that as a house style in whatever notation software you're working on, and you will never really have to do this again, depending on the type of piece you're working on. So if you're working on a chamber piece like this, you have a chamber house style. You're working on a solo piece, you have a solo house style. You're working on an orchestra piece, you have an orchestra house style. So this becomes really, really powerful because you learn basically how to do it by copying others, and then you basically set it and forget it. And then when you write your next piece, it becomes way easier when you get to that last engraving process to get your music more professionally presentable. So if I'm looking at a piece like this by Avner Dorman, he's published by Schirmer, and it's just a treasure trove in my eyes in terms of engraving, because now we can see exactly how does this composer engrave his music, or rather if someone is engraving for him. It doesn't really matter, right? Because we can learn a ton from this in terms of the sizing of the staff sizes, in terms of the way the metronome markings look, the tempo text looks. We can take a look at the spacing. We can take a look at how many measures are in each system, what sort of time signatures is he using, etc. And if you look at it really closely, right, you can even see things like, okay, how do I actually arrange the piano music? Because what stuff, gets a stem down like this? What stuff gets a stem up? There's just so much stuff that it can be gleaned from this if you look at it measure by measure. If you look at the expression markings, right, the pianissimo, right, the fortissimos, you'll notice that compared to the previous example I showed you, they're much smaller, right, maybe 10 to 20% smaller. So we can really get a sense of what should professionally engraved music look like. Because here's the truth. You don't need to be, or rather, here's the dirty little secret. You don't need to be professionally published, to have professionally presentable music. We can do this ourselves, and you can actually engrave music just like this yourself. And I've done it. I've seen countless students do it. It's definitely possible. So it's just up to you to put in the work and decide to do it, right? Because you can definitely elevate your music 10x, let's say, just by comparing the exact type of ensemble that you're writing with pieces that have already been engraved. And on top of that, I would highly suggest you do it with music that is contemporary. Don't go back to older scores and try to do this, because you're not gonna have fun with it, because the engraving practices are different. And then you're gonna see music that is not engraved in a computer either. So that's not gonna be super helpful to you either. So just keep that in mind going forward. And by the way, if you want to learn more about how to get your music commissioned, performed, and recognized in this crazy world of contemporary concert music, I have a video right over here that should help you out with that. And in the meantime, I got to get out of here because I have some errands to do and I got to find my umbrella and I don't know where it is, so I'll catch you in the next one.